All right, hello everybody. Today we're going to be talking about Reies Lopez Tijerina. If I just call him Lopez once in a while, because that's what he went by. By the way, most people with Latino heritages have two last names. This is the last name of their father, and this is the last name of their mother. Okay, the last name of his father is what they generally go by, so I just might call him Lopez in the subsequent lecture. My question is my favorite one. What strikes you about Lopez Tijerina? How did he try to achieve justice, and did he succeed? And once again, I'm cribbing from one of my mentors at UC Davis. If any of you go to UC Davis, take a class. They have a great history department. Lorena Oropesa is their Mexican-American borderlands, one of their Mexican-American borderlands historians. She recently wrote a book called The King of Adobe. And adobe is the clay-like structure that people in the Southwest and many parts of the world build their houses with. So Lopez Tijerina was born in 1926 in a small little farming town in Texas. His parents were Antonio Lopez and Erlinda. Oh, yeah, Justin's here. And Erlinda. And they were both migrant farm workers. However, at the age of when Lopez Tijerina was 2, his mother died. And when he was also a young man, his grandfather witnessed the Texas Rangers string up his father. So as you know about the history of the Texas Rangers, by now this probably comes as a tragic but not unfortunate surprise for you. So what do you think his grandfather did after he saw his son getting hung by the Texas Rangers? What would you have done, Lee, Yadira, Emma, or Justin, if you were grandpa? Take a guess. What would you do, Lee, if you saw your son get hung?
Get revenge.
Yeah, his grandfather became an outlaw, right? And sought revenge. We don't know much about what became of his grandfather after this, but he became yet another Joaquin. And again, this is the last part of assignment 3. You're going to be reading this epic poem that really shaped the Mexican-American and Chicano movement in the late 60s. So as an orphan, he was sent to the Assembly God Bible Institute in El Paso, Texas, an evangelical Christian school. And he loved it. He really excelled. He was a charismatic, smart people person and an exciting talker. And he became an evangelical preacher. And in 1957, he said he had this vision, right? That Jesus came to him and he had a dream. He said that he wants to lead Mexican Americans out of bondage, right? And he'd quote Exodus from the Bible, in which Jews were led out of bondage out of Egypt. He wanted to do the same for Mexicans in the American Southwest. So he quickly gathered quite a following in this part of Texas. And like many counterculture folks in the 1960s, he started a commune. Communes were a common way to sort of rebel against culture and try to create your own utopia, right? Your own utopian society in which people share and there's more equity. Excuse me. So he created this place called the Valley of Peace Commune in southern Arizona, but they actually became so successful and so popular that many of the white ranchers who lived around there felt threatened by the increasing number of Mexican Americans who seemed happy and healthy and didn't need them. So they were ran out of Arizona. So being run out of Arizona, where is Lopez Tijerina going to go? Well, he goes south of the border. He goes to Mexico from the late 50s into the early 60s. And post-revolutionary Mexico at this time, sure, there was a lot of corruption going on, but there was also a lot of land reform and actual politically progressive policies that were being put forth in Mexico. For example, one of them is what Emilio Zapata and the Zapatistas from the southern state of Morelos were demanding. They were demanding land and freedom. And this experience of his in Mexico, living in a country in which the federal government And please interrupt me whenever. I love it. So during this time in Mexico, the federal government was reallocating unused land to peasant communities, right? And the peasant communities would own this land in common, right? For example, Lee could not sell a little parcel of his land, right, if he was part of the community. He could grow whatever he wanted on it, right, and use the profits of that however he wanted, but the land had to stay owned in commune. And what's more, these communities had shared access to farm timber, fishing, grazing, irrigation, waterways, right? So it was just an alternative way to own land that countered the extreme privatization of the porfiriato, the privatization of land we saw, for example, in the Tomochic lecture. So after 6 years of experiencing and really studying land reform in Mexico, he returned to one of the poorest places in the United States and still today. About a year and a half ago, I drove through New Mexico, northern New Mexico right here. And yeah, it almost seems like a different country. It's just very, very impoverished. There's a lot of Native American reservations there, a lot of Mexican Americans. So he returned to this part of New Mexico. And he had a series of goals, as usual. Again, he's a very charismatic individual. And he set out these goals on a series of stump speeches. He would go out and speak and people would just gather because he's got that evangelical preacher talk going. He wanted to settle historical wrongs in the Southwest. He wanted to instill an aspect of cultural pride in Mexican Americans, right? Brown pride, just like African Americans were embracing Black power, right? He wanted Mexican Americans to embrace brown power. And what's more, he wanted to unite Mexican American and Native Americans because he argued that they had shared interests. And their interests related to land rights and civil rights in the United States. And you know what treaty is he going to bring up in order to make his argument that Mexican Americans should have better access to land?
Hidalgo, Guadalupe.
Exactly. So he literally would talk about the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo over and over, and Article 9 in it that promised Mexican Americans their liberty, their property, and their civil rights. All right. And he just didn't talk about it in these rural, poor areas of New Mexico. He took it to Washington, D.C. He went and got himself a suit and some nice glasses, and he had around him a group of very loyal allies, and they all suited up and went to Washington, D.C. And he went there, and he's not trained as a lawyer, right? He's what you call an autodidact. An autodidact is somebody who has educated themselves outside of formal schooling. So he went to the US Supreme Court, he went to Washington, D.C. Congress people and judicial officials, whoever would listen to him. And he said that the Mexican Americans in the Southwest demand 3.7 million acres. Okay. He also asked the Mexican government to help him in his cause. Do you think the Mexican government helped Lopez? No, yeah, he was right. No way. Mexican government said, no way, this guy is a radical, no thank you. But he did put political pressure in a very media savvy way, and the media loved him. They would record him because he was just kind of loud and proud, and he brought in the good ratings. And he knew it, and that's why he dressed like this. He also sought help from LULAC. Remember, LULAC is the one who helped the Mendez case against Westminster? Do you think LULAC helped this guy? Good guess. I see Lee venturing a yes. Emma, Justin, or Yadira, what do you think? Do you think LULAC helped him? No, he was too radical. LULAC did not want to go about bringing upon change in such a radical way, right? Oh, he actually tried to arrest a Supreme Court justice, by the way. He tried to do a citizen's arrest. Yeah, that's how he rolled. I forgot to add that in there. So that's why they're like, no, we're not going to help you. So here's one way in which he tried to help Mexican Americans get civil rights.
I want to hear more about this. What? Because to do a citizen's arrest, you gotta they either gotta commit a felony or a misdemeanor in your presence, which
He argued that because that there's so many landless Mexican Americans in northern New Mexico, that it's a violation of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and therefore the Supreme Court should uphold this treaty that the Senate passed.
amazing.
Yeah, and it's also, he knew this is political pressure. He knew nothing was going to change, right? But he just wanted to get the ball rolling. Because remember, this is the 1960s. There is revolution afoot on so many fronts in the United States, as you'll see in the wonderful Dolores Huerta video. Oh, by the way, about the Dolores Huerta video, please watch that as soon as possible because, anyway, it might, I don't know, technologically, Yadira knows what I mean. It might go away because I uploaded it today. So if you can watch that Dolores Huerta video as soon as possible, that would be good. Get back to this. And if it goes away, let me know and I'll reboot it. So having failed to affect any real political change in Washington, D.C., he did get his name out there. People knew who this guy was. So he founded something called the Federal Alliance for Land Grants. In Spanish, it's something different, but this is it. And in these 4 years of its existence, it had about 20,000 members, most of them from northern New Mexico. This is a lot of members, right? This is a big organization, and he's making a lot of political waves in this part of the world at the time. And what do you do to even make yourself more renowned and in the public consciousness at this time? Well, you march, right? In 1963, African Americans did a march on Washington to bring up their issues of civil rights. There were marches against the Vietnam War during this time. So he and thousands of other members of Alianza and their allies marched from Albuquerque to the capital of New Mexico, which is Santa Fe, to raise awareness of the land issue. And here they are literally marching in the streets. You're also going to see how, in the movie Dolores, how farm workers marched from, I think, Salinas to Sacramento. Okay, again, in order to raise awareness. And of course, authorities harassed the march along the way, not surprisingly, just like they harassed the Mexican American farm workers movement in California. So they did a march, right? And sure, did that move the needle? Well, maybe. It looks like they have at least one, right, white American woman ally, maybe two. Right, so they're gaining allyship throughout a cross section of folks in the United States, mostly in the Southwest. So this doesn't really change the needle that much, but he continues going, right? He is a very passionate, driven man. So what's the next thing you do? Occupy. Remember, people on the border, well, heck, people all over America are armed, so including Mexican Americans. So they decided to occupy the Kit Carson National Forest, which if you look on the map, it's a big, huge national forest in northern New Mexico. And their main argument, right, the spark of their argument that caused them to do that was white ranchers were allowed access to the Kit Carson National Forest to graze their cattle. Okay, if you pay a small fee, and sometimes even if you don't pay a small fee, you can bring your cattle to graze on the land. And I'm sure many of you all have gone hiking out in Lassen or other national forests and you come across a bunch of cows. Yeah, same dealio. However, Mexican Americans said, well, hey, federal government, we want to grow some corn in the national forest. Can we give you a small fee? Right? They're allowed to graze their cattle. What about us growing some corn and beans and squash? No, they said, no, you can't do that. So this was their argument their argument for occupying the land. So during their occupation, they vandalized the grave of Kit Carson. So the official grave site says, Kit Carson, he led the way, right? He was one of the many settler Americans who came west. But they wrote, he, quote, killed and led countless natives to their death, led the way. Right, so just straight up just vandalizing it in order to, with political objectives. Oh, and I kid you not. So, you know, their occupation of the Kit Carson National Forest, they renamed it the Republic of San Joaquin del Cañon. There's Joaquin again. Lee, aren't you going to name your firstborn or at least your next dog Joaquin? You got to. Here you go. Yep, they called it the Republic of San Joaquin. There you go. We can't get away from it. I am Joaquin. Who's Joaquin? They're everywhere. So the occupation in October of 66 of the Kit Carson National Forest led to rising tensions amongst Anglos, amongst Mexican Americans. Many Anglo families actually left this area, right? Because Mexican Americans were starting to just literally arm themselves. Right, here they are filling up things with gasoline to make Molotov cocktails, right? They are going to town. Here is Lopez Tijerina's wife, and here they are. They're locked and loaded, right? They got their big old rifle in the car. Oh, she was one of the more militant ones. You do not mess with Patricia at all. Again, this would make a great movie. I think I took the picture out of Patricia. Where's Patricia? There she is. They called her Patsy, but here she is, hurling a bottle at the sign in Santa Fe, New Mexico. A Molotov cocktail, mind you. And what ended up ensuing? There was a gun battle. And there was a gun battle between federal forces and local authorities and the Alianza people. He took 4 National Forest Service Rangers. He arrested 4 of them. He later let them go after about 4 hours. And then he fled. He fled into the mountains. And it's hard for me to get footage. There used to be footage of tanks going up into the Kit Carson National Forest looking for him, literally big old military vehicles, and they couldn't find him. But after a couple days, he turned himself into the authorities. Again, this is more of this is more political theater than actually thinking that the federal government's going to give up any of this land. This is complete political theater. So he turned himself in, spent 35 days in jail, and then he was released. Why do you think they released him? Why release him if he was the head of this just violent occupation of federal property and in which an officer was wounded? What do you think, Justin, Emma, Lee, or Yadira?
Probably because it was an incredibly controversial arrest.
They didn't want him to turn into a martyr, right? Remember, this is the time Malcolm X has recently been assassinated. Civil rights movements, there's a Native American rights movements, there's the Vietnam War going on. Revolution is in the air in the United States, I kid you not. Even more so than like right now.
It would have probably been like a Huey P. Newton situation.
Yep. Good point. And I understand there's a decent movie about Huey Newton and the Black Panthers on Netflix. I have not seen it, but I have to give it a watch. You know what? To be more nuanced, because history is not simple, right? It's more complicated than you think. One of the first, I think the first Mexican-American senator in Washington, D.C. was this guy named Joseph Montoya. He represented New Mexico. And he, like many other kind of mainstream, moderate Hispanics, did not like Lopez Tijerina's tactics. They thought he was just one of those other young radicals who wanted violent takeover of the government. So New Mexico Senator Joseph Montoya was not down with his tactics. So what happens next? While awaiting trial, right? He's awaiting trial for the federal charges that he led this occupation. His group, La Alianza, was having a meeting, and the authorities came and broke up the meeting. So not taking that, the Alianza members gathered together, went and marched on the county courthouse in Tierra Amarilla, New Mexico, Yellow Earth, New Mexico. And they took the county courthouse, took it, held it at gunpoint, and made a citizen's arrest of the district attorney. So again, it doesn't seem like he's getting it. He is not standing down. He continues to do these very public and theatrical, embarrassing things to the authorities and representatives of New Mexico. So he was arrested, of course, again. However, again, he was released. In 1968, he was released from jail once again. And again, you can guess why. Why keep releasing this guy if he keeps like not behaving? What do you think? Why release him? What do you think? Yadira, Lee, Emma, or Justin? Go ahead, Yadira. I get so sick of my voice.
Same reason as before, what Lee said.
Yeah, revolution is in the air. In the summer of 1968 in Chicago, Illinois, the Democrats were having a convention in which they were going to choose their presidential candidate. It was a very contested convention, and it turned out to be this bloody police attacking protesters and protesters fighting back. It was something the United States hadn't seen since like the Civil War. It really seemed like revolution was in the air. Okay. What's more, Martin Luther King and a bunch of other civil rights leaders were organizing, pardon me, Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders were organizing what they're calling the People's March on Washington. 5 years later, they successfully organized the March on Washington to bring light to the plight of African Americans and their demands for civil rights. So Martin Luther King called up Lopez Tijerina and he said, hey, can you be the leader of the Mexican American contingent? Not the contingent, but can you come and help us co-lead and co-march? And he said, heck yeah. So the march was to happen in June 1968. Anybody know what happened in April of that year, a couple months before? What happened 2 months before the poor people marched to Martin Luther King?
He was assassinated.
Yep, like that U2 song says, early morning, April 3rd. April 3rd or 4th, doesn't matter. Martin Luther King had turned radical by this point. He was no longer like the darling of moderate white Americans because he had turned radical against the war. He was very vocal in that he knew that economic rights, you needed economic rights in order to have civil rights. So he worked very hard the last few years of his life, bringing about economic rights for sanitation workers, for example, in Memphis, Tennessee.
And I mean, honestly, the modern perception of Martin Luther King as like the peaceful alternative to Malcolm X was only kind of technically true, and it wasn't really, the view of most like white people at the time.
No, Lee's exactly right. At least in the early 60s, Malcolm X struck a very radical picture to most middle-class white allies or wannabe allies. And they said, man, we don't want this radical guy named Malcolm X who's part of the Nation of Islam. And he's saying, wow, bullets or ballots. We like this kind of well-dressed, PhD educated preacher guy who seems to talk, and with a level head. But you're right, later on in life, he became a lot more radical, and that's part of his life most Americans don't hear about. So check it out. A little like 3 weeks after Martin Luther King was assassinated, moments after this photograph was taken, Lopez Tijerina's home in New Mexico was bombed. Right? This was a time of violence, of uncertainty. A couple months later, Robert F. Kennedy, right, the brother of John F. Kennedy, was campaigning in LA, California after he just won the LA primary. He was going to be probably the next president of the United States. He was killed in LA, right? So this was a time of assassinations all over and violence against leaders.
You know who bombed his home?
Do we know who bombed his home? Nope. Woo, there's a question for you. Nope. Unsubstantial evidence. They couldn't get enough evidence. This is also a time of militant attacks against like John Trudell in the Native American movement up in the Dakotas. So if you want to look up John Trudell, he's another activist who was attacked. However, the Poor People's March happened. Here's an image from it. And Lopez Tijerina was there. Here he is on the right. Here is the great civil rights leader, Ralph Abernathy. And this Native American leader, I have forgotten his name and I've been trying to Google who he is. So if any of you all know who this, he's famous for wearing the shades and the big feather headdress. Let me know. I've just forgotten his name in the course of my life. So this is at the Poor People's March, okay? And Lopez Tijerina continued to travel the nation and try to, really make more active and try to organize people like the Brown Berets. Right here, the Brown Berets in Oakland, California. And their organization basically wanted to help feed local, Latino community, wanted to protect them from the police, right? And here he is talking to them. So Lopez Tijerina, you could not keep this man down. He tried to run for governor of New Mexico, but he was found ineligible because he had been in prison so often. So he was deemed ineligible to run for governor, yet he did form the People's Constitutional Party, just again, in order to get people politicized so they go and vote or do something. Here he is again in Oakland, California at a Brown Beret rally, and he was arrested for once again just organizing and not behaving according to authorities. However, this time when he was arrested, he was released on one condition, that he didn't organize Mexican Americans anymore. And after his, I think, 15, 16 months in prison, he came back a broken man. Lorena Oropeza, the author of the book I'm cribbing this from, makes a very compelling argument that while he was in jail, he was subjected to sort of psychedelic, I don't even want to say medications, but torture that broke his spirit and broke his brain. For the rest of his life, he was a much slower man. He was much more scared. He just seemed like he experienced some serious he had post-traumatic stress syndrome. And it came from his last stint in jail. And he said as much in subsequent interviews. I encourage you can Google a couple of his interviews later in life, and he's a changed man. In 2006, he returned to El Paso, Texas to live the remaining days of his life. However, still today, in this part of New Mexico in which he was headquartered, in which he fought for land rights, there's still a sign that says land or death, Viva Zapata. And there's still continued court battles over land use and resource access in this part of New Mexico still today. It's in the courts. Okay. And you all are I'm going to be also uploading, I think, a 13-minute radio piece about Lopez Tijerina. All right. It's a powerful short piece that really will reinforce and probably, complement what I've been talking about. So there it is, the king of Adobe, the lost prophet of the Chicano movement. Okay. Questions or comments? Let's just go through what struck you about this little discussion. And if you have any comments, can I start with you, Justin? Hello, Justin.
Hi. Questions or comments? I don't know. I missed the beginning part of it because I went to the wrong meeting. But
that's totally fine. While you're thinking of something, I can pick on Emma. I saw her playing with the green light.
Yeah, sure.
Emma, go for it.
At some point you mentioned that his home was bombed and they never really figured out who it was. I was wondering if that was just like terrorism and political intimidation, or was that like intended to be an assassination attempt?
Well, in this book, Lorena Oropeza argues that it was a consistent pattern of terrorism and just scaring right? All these political dissidents, whether it's John Trudell, who I mentioned, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, so many dissident leaders during the 60s were either straight up assassinated or killed for reasons that historians are still trying to get to the bottom of. For example, there's still a lot of there's still a lot of information that's still considered classified that historians are trying to use the Freedom of Information Act to get. So I'll have to dig deeper into Lorena Oropez's book, but her idea is that it was political intimidation.
Okay.
Yeah. Good question. Lee, what struck you about that, or any questions? Contemplate. Let me go to Yadira.
I think it's just interesting how, I mean, I've never heard of this person, but you mentioned at the beginning that he knew he wasn't going to be successful, but I think he was, like, he got across what he wanted to get across, right?
Yeah, and he just wanted to like start a movement and get other people going too, right? Because you can't be the one crazy guy in the corner. So he was just trying to start a movement. Yeah.
I think it's no coincidence that this dude isn't more famous than he is. Like how very few people know who Fred Hampton is.
Preach. Who's Fred Hampton?
The leader of the Black Panthers party in Chicago, who was killed in his own home by the police next to his pregnant wife at 21 years old.
Yeah. No, this was, yeah. And as Americans, I think we're just starting to try to talk about this and to rectify, or at least bravely face what happened in the violence and the counter-revolutionary violence of the 1960s. Yeah. All right, Justin, have anything?
Not really, to be honest with you, but
before you chime in, I'm going to say, contact me, everybody. I'm just going to end this recording. Please Zoom me. I'll be on as usual from Tuesday from 5 to 7. That's this evening. So I hope to see you there. I'm going to stop the official recording.